Activists are young. These are the people who are driving this revolution.
There has been a lot of blood that has been spilled here, and people are going through
it. These fighters are in a defensive role. They're trying to maneuver right. They can't cross simply because a sniper right behind this pillar here.
So this is what's raining down on Idlib right now.
It was just too dangerous for us to attempt to film.
The only way to bring stability and peace to Syria is going to be for Assad to step down.
Despite the ongoing onslaught by Assad forces, the Free Syrian Army are making some progress.
Dana is now under the control of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The Free Syrian Army were forced to leave.
The refugees arrive with nothing more than their identification documents and the clothes on their backs. There are now 3 million refugees outside Syria and 6.5 million displaced internally.
More than 3 years on, what remains of Syria is a human disaster, showing no sign of stopping. It's getting worse. This country, once a proud land of rich history and culture, used to have a population of 22 million. Now, nearly half of its people have been forced out of their homes, and estimates of those killed in the war range from 100,000 to 160,000. I'm Andrew Simmons, one of Al Jazeera's correspondents, who's reported from inside the country. First, I'm going to take you on a journey through time, destruction, and human loss.
New reports a hospital in Syria has received at least 25 bodies of protesters. An official at the Deraa National Hospital says all of the bodies had bullet holes.
It started in March 2011 in a southern city most of the world had never heard of, Deraa. Reports were coming in of peaceful protests by young people. The demonstrations followed the arrest and torture of teenagers who painted some revolutionary slogans on a school wall. And then came the government's response.
Hundreds of anti-government demonstrators who marched on the southern city of Deraa were reportedly met with a hail of police bullets. These pictures, taken from internet social networks, show the devastating outcome.
But this did nothing to end the protests.
The significance of today is that the protests in Deraa have spread throughout Syria. Here in the capital Damascus, there were demonstrations in different parts of town. They were dispersed by the security and some people were arrested. In other parts of Syria, like Homs, Hama, the Zabadin, Latakia, all these towns witnessed rallies. Now, some of these where hundreds of people took part and other thousands of people.
And wherever the people rallied, the security forces came to confront them.
The peaceful demonstrations had nothing to do with other people who were inside these demonstrations, who themselves had arms and were shooting at the security forces and were shooting at other citizens in Deraa. This is when security had to retaliate. At the end of the day, this became a matter of national security.
But Assad's retaliation becomes more and more brutal. And by July, hundreds of people are killed in the crackdown.
And we have breaking news for you. U.S. President Barack Obama looks set to ask Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to step down.
For months, the world has borne witness to the Assad regime's contempt for its own people. In peaceful demonstrations across the nation, Syrians are demanding their universal human rights. The regime has answered their demands with empty promises and horrific violence.
Yet Assad isn't really isolated. He has powerful allies in Russia and China. And in October came the first of 4 vetoes of UN Security Council resolutions condemning his government. Eventually, the protest movement is transformed into an armed rebellion. Dozens of officers defect from the army and join the opposition.
4 or 5 citizens were killed before our eyes by snipers. People were afraid of us. They were afraid of being murdered. We were told there were terrorists, but we didn't find any.
The Syrian military steps up its campaign and uses warplanes to bombard areas taken over by the rebels. Despite all the deaths, Assad insists he's not targeting innocent people.
Nobody kill, no government in the world kill its people unless it's led by a crazy person. For me as president, I became president because of the public support.
By February 2012, the United Nations reports more than 7,500 people have been killed in Syria. Most of these are civilians.
We see neighborhoods shelled indiscriminately, hospitals used as torture centers, children as young as 10 years old jailed and abused. We see almost certain crimes against humanity.
Just a few months later, the UN declares Syria is in a state of civil war and suspends its mission there. Peace plans and ceasefires are put forward, but nothing stops more than a year of killing and devastation. There's a renewed effort in September 2012. Veteran diplomat Lakhdar Brahimi is selected as the new UN peace envoy to Syria after Kofi Annan resigns. At the end of the year, the US and Britain, among other states, recognize the Syrian National Coalition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Throughout the conflict, tens of thousands of people escaped Syria to find refuge. And this number reaches 1 million in March 2013. By July, the UN says 100,000 people have been killed.
But we open this news hour in Syria, where activists say government forces have fired rockets with chemical warheads into suburbs of the capital, Damascus. It's thought hundreds of people, many of them children, may have been killed.
Activists are calling it a chemical massacre. They accuse the government of using banned weapons. Opposition groups say that around 3 a.m. on Wednesday, government forces fired rockets on a number of areas in eastern Ghouta, an area of countryside east of the capital, Damascus.
The allegations of a chemical weapons attack prompt Barack Obama to make a second red line ultimatum. A strike on Syria by the US military seems inevitable. But despite what looked like a build-up to a potential attack, the moment comes and goes.
Once you set a red line, you better be prepared to back it up. And the U.S. looked very feckless until Putin, of all people, bailed out the administration.
An agreement at last. Russia and the United States have reached a deal to rid Syria of its arsenal of chemical weapons.
This deal is a deal that would have been unthinkable a week ago, and we're getting it welcomed from capitals all around the world. Having said that, when the US and Russia do a deal, it's a done deal, it becomes a reality, and the only option really is for world leaders to welcome it.
All the time, the humanitarian situation in Syria is getting worse. The number of people driven out of the country passes 2 million. International inspectors begin destroying Syria's chemical weapons arsenal. The Syrian government and the opposition meet in Geneva for UN-arranged peace talks, but there's no breakthrough.
Why doesn't President Assad, for the good of his nation, for the good of his people, step aside and someone else take power?
Excuse me, and you
the Assad family have had power for 44 years. Maybe that's long enough.
You know the good for his nation, or the Syrian people know what is good for them. We are 10,000 years old. We know what's good for us.
Like Kofi Annan, the man before him, Lakhdar Brahimi also resigns as UN peace envoy to Syria.
Apologies
once more that we haven't been able to help them as much as they deserve, as much as we should have, and also to tell them that the tragedy in their country shall be solved. They have shown incredible resilience and dignity.
And so now, with diplomacy in tatters, the chance of a negotiated settlement is even more remote. There's a painful, bloody stalemate.
I think one of the most debilitating factors for the opposition rebels on the ground has been the lack of one channel of support to them. Instead, we had different countries starting to support different groups, which directly fragmented the fighting opposition forces on the ground, and it also enabled, in a vacuum that developed, even those areas that were so-called liberated, other more extreme elements to take hold. What we have now is a hurting stalemate, in my view, where we see the battlefield shift in small distances over a period of a week or a month. But neither side, therefore, will win, in my view. Maybe in the longer term, Assad could probably claim some form of a military victory if more support isn't given to the opposition. But what really is happening is that the state of Syria is being systematically destroyed.
Now we've seen something of what brought Syria to this point. So how can anyone have hope? We're now going to take a look at what should be the main fabric of a country. Its education system, medical care, housing. One of the most alarming issues is the destruction of the country's health service. What remains of it just can't cope with demand. This is a snapshot of the situation in the countryside near Aleppo after an artillery attack. You may find some of the images disturbing. Then up the road, this pickup truck is taking some of the first casualties to hospital. This is one of them, just 2 years old. They did what they could to save him. His mother is in the only other bed. "I don't have a problem," she said, "I'm fine," wanting all the medics to concentrate on her son. But an hour later, they had to give up. Then came commotion. As more of the injured arrived, there's no space left in the emergency room. 7 adults and 2 more children under 5. The survivors are also present, amongst them more children, no physical injuries, but emotional trauma that will live on long after Syria's war. But the medical staff are overwhelmed, and there are more casualties packing into this chaotic space. One of the Al Jazeera team, who's medically trained, helps treat one of the children. Everyone is trying to help, but the pressure this tiny hospital is under is simply appalling. And now this child has died on the reception room floor. It isn't long before there's a rush to get out of this hospital. For the injured, what will be a frantic drive to the nearest border for treatment in a Turkish hospital. For the dead, a return to the village attacked by Assad's forces. More funerals. One more day of hopelessly inadequate attempts here to save lives. And everyone expects many more days like this. And sadly, there have been many more days like that one, and far worse all over Syria. Too many. So many lives lost, so many ruined. And while you'd expect hospitals and doctors to be safe in a conflict, think again. Physicians for Human Rights says 460 healthcare professionals have been killed since the conflict began. Nearly half of Syria's hospitals have either been destroyed or damaged, and many doctors have also left the country. For example, before the war, there were 800 doctors in the city of Homs. The siege brought the number down to only 3. And it's both sides who have been targeting medical staff and hospitals. Another essential public service is education. For millions of children, there hasn't been any school, any learning for 3 years. The latest figures show more than half of Syrian children are no longer in school. In the cities of Al-Raqqa and Aleppo, that number is more than 90%. And in rural Damascus, nearly 70% of children aren't being schooled. By the end of 2013, out of Syria's 20,000 schools, 4,000 are out of use. They've been destroyed, damaged, or they're providing shelter for displaced people.
All concerted efforts should be on education of children. At least if there is a war going on inside Syria, then those who reach safety in the surrounding countries, resources should be put on the table so that the international organization on the ground, the national government of these 4 or 5 countries can make space and provide education to the children. Unless we get the resources we need, we all be complacent. History will not forgive.
For the homeless, the displaced, the refugees, it's all about survival. More of an existence than a real life. And after all this time, it's hardly surprising that there's a feeling of alienation, a sense their plight is ignored by the outside world. This is Atma camp for the internally displaced in Syria near the Turkish border, home to Bassem Haj Khalid and his family. I first met them in the summer of 2012. They didn't have a roof over their heads, but Bassem was refusing to move across the border to run away from his homeland.
I have believed in this earth and love this chance, this praise, okay? This is the Syrian people. This is our land, okay? I love it.
Come the winter, a few months later, he was a different man, still resilient, but under pressure.
The good idea. All of my country destroyed now, and I have a war.
If it hadn't been for the war, he'd have qualified as a lawyer by now.
Okay.
Determined to be of use, he opened his own school in a tent. 18 months on, I was in touch with him again just the other day. His savings are long gone, his old permanent home now destroyed. He had to close his makeshift school. There was a desperation you could see in his eyes. He once had a comfortable middle-class life. Bassem now is a broken man. He's still trying to outwardly appear optimistic like so many others who manage to smile while grappling with depression or trauma. One man among millions who can't see a future. And try to absorb the vast numbers of people in the same and often worse situation. More than 22 million lived in Syria before the war started. Nearly half of the people have been forced to leave their homes. Of these, around 6 million are internally displaced. The remaining 3 million are refugees. There were more than 500,000 Palestinian refugees living inside Syria. 270,000 of them are now displaced within the country, and 75,000 have become refugees for a second time. In better times, Syria was known as the breadbasket of the region. Its fertile land provided food. It had a thriving export business with a healthy manufacturing industry and oil production. Now, it's a country of poor people. By the end of last year, 3/4 of the population lived in poverty. More than half are believed to be in extreme poverty, so people don't have access to basic food items. But even worse, 20% of Syrians are living in what's classed as abject poverty. That means they're facing starvation and malnutrition. The situation is profound in Yarmouk, a besieged district of Damascus, once the biggest refugee camp for Palestinians. It used to stand as a beacon of the Syrian state's support for their cause, but it's now a place of misery, bombed out and inhabited by opposition fighters and a dwindling number of Palestinians. The ones who stayed are victims of a different kind of weapon of war, starvation.
People are being effectively cut off from the essential means of life, so they're not being able to access food, water and adequate medical care, and that the government forces in particular have been strangling neighbourhoods and communities who they see as supportive of the opposition as a way of pressurising them and any armed groups which might be within them. Starvation, war crime as it is, immensely indiscriminate as it is, does appear to be succeeding in to the backdrop of a paralysed Security Council. The government forces in particular are able to starve communities into submission.
What remains of the Syrian state more than 3 years on is a harsh, uncaring landscape. So many lives lost, so many ruined. The last words go to Syrian refugees, somehow managing to get by in neighbouring countries.
والله أنا برأيي يعني إنه قضيتنا صارت فلسطينية. صعبة هلا طويلة، إيه قضيتنا طويلة بعد. ما بترجع. هيك ما فيني أنا أحكي يعني. إحنا بنقول إن شاء الله نرجع. إن شاء الله نرجع أطراف سوريا أحسن من قصر بلبنان. نزلينا ما من الشعب، نزلينا من منظمات أكثر من الشعب. كان متحدين، كان إنقاذ طفل، كان رؤية عالمية، كان مستوصفات، كان مستشفيات، كلنا نزلينا فيه أكثر من الشعب.
والله اني انت بحساب انه كل من يساعد بشار بانتخاب او يساعده بكلمه فهو مشارك بالاجرام تبعه، لانه ذبحنا بشار وانتهك حرماتنا ودمرنا تدمير كله مشان الكرسي.
نحن بدنا بلادنا ترتاح، هذا اللي بدنا اياه، ولا هذا ابن سوريا وهذا ابن سوريا، ما فينا نحكي لا هيك ولا هيك، ما فينا نزود يعني، فهمت شلون؟ بدنا الرياحه بس، ولا ان شاء الله ترتاح بلادنا وان شاء الله بيتفقوا اللي عم بيعملوا هالاشياء هذه ان شاء الله رب العالمين، وان شاء الله نكون بخير، وان شاء الله نكون نحياكم بالف سعاده، هذا اللي بدنا اياه، نحن بعز الله يساعدنا بالشرف. يا اول امبارح انا اجيت بدي ابكي بهالسن هذا بهالشكل هذا، شنو ما في، بدنا ناكل نشرب، بدنا نعيش مثل العالم، مثل هذا كلام صعب ما في.
لك يا بنت الحلال، هالانتخابات اللي راح 300,000 قتيل، واللي تهجر مليون مواطن و10 مليون مواطن تهجر، ولك اللي انقصت ايده ما راحت ما تصفى دمه، شو عم ينتخب ولا شيء؟ شو انت ملك 7 سنين مثلك مثل اي دوله، اوباما عم يضل 4 سنين، شو المعنى؟ انا مو انه بكرهه، انا كنت عايش على عهده ملك، بس وقت اللي تجاوز حدوده صار يذبح الطفل والولد ويجيب مرتزقه ما عاد نحبه اذا بيكون ابونا. ليش بدنا نكذب عليك؟ نحن عم تخبى اصبعتنا هيك، كل هاي هون عم بتنافق وتقول لك بدي اروح انتخب، والله اللي انتخب ما عنده ضمير، اللي ميت اخوه، هلا هون موجود معنا واحد ميت خيو، ليكي اللي وراكي قصوه بالمنشار، في دين عند الله بيقصوه هيك مثل الحطب، يخلصيني، صار ظلم اكثر من ايام الظلم، عايشين تحت الصفر 100 درجه هلا، وكله حاجبين حالنا، انا عمري هلا اني 70 سنه، شو بدي اضبط وضعي غير عن اول يعني؟ وقت اللي كنت ما طلع من امري شيء، هلا شو بدي يطلع من امري؟ والله العظيم هذا الشعب كله مظلوم، بس يا حرام هلا اني ما يكونوا 5 مع بعضهم، هلا كيف اجوا، انا ما بحكي غير قدام واحد او 2، بيكونوا 4 5 بيقول والله ماشي حاله النظام، هذا ابننا وهذا ابونا، كذب كذب هذا النظام، والله اسرائيل ما عم تعمل هيك.
بشار الاسد منتهي يعني ما في مجال عن الامر هذا، وهذه لعبه مؤامره اكيد على نفس السيناريو الفلسطيني تكرر علينا نحن نفسه، تهجر ولجوء وخيام، بس يعني نحن بنطلب من رب العالمين، ما نطلب من غيره، لا الدول العربيه ولا الدول الغربيه ولا حد يساعدنا، المساعده بالحكي بس ما اكثر من هيك. نحن اطفال، نحن تهجرنا، في اطفال خلقت هون، هاي ما لها مستقبل، انا ولدي هذا خلق هون ما له مستقبل نهائيا. منطقه اخذها اليوم بكره بده يخسرها، وهو بالايام بده يخسر الشام كلياتها وبده يخسر سوريا كلياتها، وما راح يضل غير. وهي المؤامره تقسيم سوريا انه يعملوا منطقه ساحليه، منطقه علويه هذه او دوله علويه، هذا امر مفروغ منه ومستحيل. انا بالنسبه لي ما بقى عندي خوف، عندي خوف لاولادي، لمستقبل اولادي، ما اكثر من هيك يعني. انا هذا الخوفي.